like to ask Tamsin Hanke, who won the 2013 President's Dissertation Medal with her work Magnetogorsk, Utopian Vision of Spatial Socialism, nominated for the awards by the Bartlett School of Architecture. Tamsin. Thank you.
The pleasure of going first. I want to talk to you about Magnetogorsk. Magnetogorsk is a city on the far east of the Ural mountain range. Up here. And it's a city of about 500,000 people that was built over about 5 years in the years from 1929. It had always existed as a place, but a very, very small settlement of about 500 people. And it had been discovered in 1700 as this settlement because there was a military base that was posted just to the north. And the people posted in this military base realised that their compasses were always being sort of messed about and they couldn't understand what it was. But the reason was that there was this huge reserve of magnetite iron ore forming a mountain range that they discovered using magnets. So in 1929, Stalin decided, as part of his 5-year plan, to change the way that Russia was structured, that he wanted to move the economy from agrarian to one based on industry. And key to this was the idea of mono-industry cities. These would be built around a single industry that would form the basis of an entire new settlement that didn't anymore need to be based in areas because of their defence, because of trade, but actually they could be just positioned because of productivity. So this invited this whole new school of thought about what urban settlements could be about. And Stalin was really aware of this, and he looked to Campanella's City of the Sun as a utopian settlement that he wanted to kind of promote for these new cities. And Magnetogorsk was going to be the poster boy of all these cities. It was, because of the magnetite iron ore, going to be Russia's heart of steel manufacturing. So he launched an architectural competition in 1929. And key entries to this were by Nikolai Militin at the top, Ivan Leonidov and Ernst May. And all three of these suggested ideas of the linear city and how this might work to produce a city that was all about efficiency, productivity and manufacturing. So Militin looked for these sort of zoned bands of activity that would run along the Ural River. The Ural River separates Europe from Asia, and Magnetogorsk staggers the two sides of this. So they looked at how you might use these kind of zoned activities running in a linear direction to ensure equitable distribution and an efficient manufacturing society. The bottom, Leonidov furthered this by looking at block formation, that you might create a city using these blocks along a linear expanse that would be able to just keep growing. And then Ernst May, who eventually sort of won this competition, furthered this by looking at how these blocks might then be subdivided into quarters, so that blocks might integrate with each other and sort of talk to each other. Now, really important in looking at these ideas of sort of an industrial urban typology was looking at actually what the intentions were, not just to produce a city that would be efficient, but also to produce a new kind of people that would live in these cities and be a new type of person. And that the intention for this was no longer will these people be peasants, they will be turned into the real proletariat fighting for Russia's future. So the ideas of urbanism were looking very much to a kind of industrial typology that looked to use space to instigate a sort of instinctive response in the people that would live in these cities, to make them, in a way, sort of alienated from each other, but also working for this cause. So it kind of, looking at Bentham's Panopticon, gives us the idea of the way in which space can be used instinctively. Whether or not there is a garden or rotunda, people will still act as if there is. And at the bottom, this was very much looked at by architects like to do these as the salt works, that whether or not the guard is in the house, people will instinctively react to space in a predictable way. And then this was furthered by Owen's New Lanark. And then really importantly for Magnetogorsk is Detroit, and the way in which the city looked with Henry Ford and Albert Kahn about the idea of efficiency by using specialized space and how this can be laid out, sort of this spatial way of setting out an efficient productive environment. When they were building Magnetogorsk, it was very much in their minds that these cities like Gary, Indiana were being built in the West. And there was this dialogue that was happening. The engineers that were setting out the factory in Magnetogorsk were flown in from America, and a lot of this sort of setting out of the city was done by Americans that were very aware of Albert Kahn and Ford's work. So the beginning of the city very much was shock construction. It started in 1929, and over 5 years the city went from 500 to 500,000. People were brought in from partially forced labour, partially recruitment, and partially kind of migrations into these settlements, which were really, really isolated. I mean, when people arrived at the train station, they realised that it was in fact just one track leading out into nothingness. The initial workforce was really migratory. People came and they were subjected to really quite harsh conditions. This is in the middle of the Siberian steppe with no settlements around it. So I talked to people when I visited there, and they were saying that they arrived in the middle of the night and they saw these lights stretching out into the horizon. And then in the morning, they thought, crikey, we've arrived in this amazing new city, it's all built. And then in the morning they woke up and they realised these were just lights out into the steppe, lighting the way into the construction site. There was nothing there. So in 1932, perestroika was introduced, so people were issued with internal passports to stop this internal migration. So actually the city of Magnetogorsk was locked down pretty much from 1932 until 1987. So the population of this city were fixed in one area. Ernst May, who won the competition, designed his idea of what the city should be, and they called him and said, right, we want to start construction, come immediately. And when he arrived, they'd already built a super block, but they built it on the wrong side of the Ural River. They V'd out the idea of a bridge crossing the Ural. So there was the factory on one side of the city, and then Ernst May wanted to build on the opposite side of the river. When he arrived, they'd actually built underneath the factory, so the direction of the wind blew the pollution right in. So he stormed out of the city, and Ivan Leonidov took over construction. And he realised very fast that what they were trying to do was well-intentioned but unsuccessful. And he said the designers of Magnetogorsk were failing. Basically what he realised was that people were coming from all these different cultural backgrounds and being forced to live in a architecturally homogeneous environment. And they were using the new blocks as toilets and storage facilities and camping next to them. So this is the final structure of the city. The Ural River runs down the middle with the factory on the eastern bank and the right at the top, and Ernst May's super block just to the south of it here. They then built the bridge over the river eventually because they realised that it was such a horrendous place to live right in the wind of the factory. So the city has been built in this linear arrangement on the western bank. So this is a couple of photos of what the city is like now, and the way in which the kind of architectural characteristics have really formed a new type of urbanism and people that live in it. So these are the block formations, and the recreational areas happen internally within the block with residences surrounding them, which means that when you're on public streets, you're very much on the outside space of these blocks. The blocks are so large that actually walking between them is very difficult. Some of them are up to a kilometre long. So people just nipping into other blocks is very, very uncommon because it's such a long way. I mean, these are scale comparators with Manhattan and Chicago, which were built as block cities, but much, much smaller blocks. So people really rely on public transport, but the public transport's built to serve the factory running between the cities. So these east-west streets along the grid serve as a sort of axial route that just serve communication between the two. And they also form these visually axial importances. So every street ends with a view of the factory that's running linearly opposite to the city. This is one of the initial plans for the factory entrance. There would be the city of the street of the workers with all of the different workers' accommodation and clubs would then axially face the front of the factory. So they'd be very much aware within the city that there was this relationship with the factory. And this is a photograph from last year where you see the top entrance. This is the furthest north of the city, looking across the bridge and down to the sort of pollution at the bottom. So this, the way that the city was set up has had a very strong impact on the way that the city is today. In 1997, Magnetogorsk city government employed a team of psychologists to come and do a study on what the impact was going to be of global capitalism reaching the city, because they were so worried that the way that the city's formed, that people were very, very nervous that when capitalism arrived, the city wouldn't be able to deal with it. And actually it's now voted, but categorised as one of the 30 most polluted cities in the world, and yet it has a relatively stable population of around 400,000 people. People aren't leaving the city. This is partially due to the fact that it's very geographically isolated, but partially to do with the fact that they just don't want to. They're fine living there. 1% of children are born healthy, but people don't move away when they're pregnant. These are some people that I met there. So this is a zoning map from 1996 that was due to be realised next year. And what's happening is, even in contemporary urban design, new areas are being reclassified at the south of the city as residents from agricultural land, rather than repopulating these very sparsely populated blocks. They're very much sticking to the grid of the linear city that was designed in 1939. You get to the end of the city and the buildings get more and more modern as you go further south, and then they just stop and you see cranes building the next phase of the city in the background. But one thing that has happened was that during privatisation, a single oligarch took control of all of the infrastructure and all of the public buildings that had previously been owned by MMK, which used to be a publicly owned company. So essentially now the city is in a state of a micro-dictatorship, that it was set up around this productive industry for the sake of a socialist ideal, but now it's privately owned, so there's kind of this neoliberal capitalism that started to creep into the city that has structured itself so heavily around this this structure that it's now perfect for exploitation by a private industry. This is the remains of the magnetic mountain from which Magnetogorsk gets its name. There's now 5 years' supply of iron ore left, but that's being held in case Russia goes to war and needs to make more things out of steel. So now Magnetogorsk imports its iron ore from Kazakhstan and its coal from further north. It's in a state where the factory no longer needs to exist. The product that it makes costs more to make than it can sell it for. And there's 400 more of these monocities in Russia, and they're all in a similar state. They were all built in the rush of the 1930s, and because of governmental complacency and a lack of modernising, they're all in a similar situation, and they're posing a great threat to the future of Russia, which is so economically based on industry, but on an industry that's so antiquated.
I mean, it's quite a remarkable political and social phenomenon that you've been writing about. And Joseph, cities have been at your heart for so many years. How does this sort of sit with your idea of town?
Well, I'm not sure it's to do with that, but I have actually been involved in planning a city not unlike Magnetogorsk and not far from it, also at the foothills of the Urals. Also abandoned by an industry. In my case, it was an armaments industry. And there, the city fathers, in their wisdom, decided that what they wanted was the Bilbao effect. So they thought they would solve the problems of this city, which is being gradually abandoned by its population, like Magnetogorsk, by building a museum of art and a splendid internal transport system and very expensive hotels. It's at the moment at proof stage, so one can't tell whether it's to be successful. It seemed to be entirely against the sort of way I thought the city might develop. And in fact, we were sacked pretty early on in the proceedings.
Do you have questions for that?
But I was wondering whether, in fact, it was what the city fathers of Magnetogorsk thought their future was going to be.
The future, I think when they initially founded it, it seemed like they planned it would exist forever. It didn't seem that there was any...
No, I meant the city fathers now.
Now, it's actually relatively successful for the sake of the private oligarch that owns the city. Even if I think what's happening with Russia at the moment is it's looking east to be able to trade and finding new markets for the metal, the steel that it is producing. It can't import this metal into Europe anymore because it doesn't meet our trading standards. So it's going east. And for the oligarch that owns the city, it's actually a relatively successful city. And he's reliant on the fact that people aren't leaving. Now, if they did start to leave, then he'd be faced with a problem, but actually at the moment he's relatively successful. But it's interesting to think about how this kind of new structure, like you say, about the Bilbao effect and sort of what's happened in Detroit, would be able to retrofit the structure that's already existed, because it's not built in the way that it could be retrofitted for that kind of.
But the situation is stable. The population is stable.
In Magnetogorsk,
yes.
It's fixed. But these 300 other ones are much smaller mine towns. And there's one, for example, just outside St. Petersburg, Pipilevo, and that has no industry left. And it's got about 25,000 people, but no industry to support them. But I think tourism is so difficult because of the transport infrastructure to get there is so important.
Alexandra, I mean, you're probably closer to this than most. I mean, before if you've got any questions for Tamsin, I just wondered whether for people here you wanted to just maybe touch on the process and why you selected this.
Yes, absolutely. Well, congratulations again in person and in public. The dissertations panel changes every year. I've been chairing it for 2 or 3 years now, I think. And we do get a great range of very good pieces of work from all around the world. It's a real delight going through them. There's a lot of them, but the overwhelming majority are exceptionally good. But I think what the priority seems to be, without any explicit agenda, I certainly don't set an intellectual agenda, and the judges are selected so that there is considerable variety of background and, I would say, intellectual thesis. But what has been absolutely more than delightful, it's been really heartening for me, and I think I would hope for everyone, is that there seems to be a kind of natural veering of all the judges towards dissertations, how would I put this, that have a relevance. I don't particularly want to call it a sort of social agenda because it might be a little bit too narrow, but there is a relevance there. It's not a kind of self-indulgent, intellectual, or rather theoretical exercise for its own sake, a lot of which we've seen a couple of decades ago, I think. So there seems to be a kind of natural turn towards very culturally aware, very ambitious, very poetic often, but ultimately quite relevant studies that talk about the world that we live in and have implications directly or indirectly about how things could get better. And I think that's a fantastic thing.
So from the initial reading, having had time to, are there any questions?
I do. I want to raise one issue. I mean, there's an awful lot, and perhaps we need to do this outside this room, that I'd love to discuss with you about this, because it is an absolutely fascinating, original piece of research that you've done there. But I want to raise one question. I'm not sure if it's a sort of fully a question. What are your thoughts on the idea of utopia? You use the word, and you've sort of used it in your subtext, and you mentioned particularly that it was sort of conceived as a utopia. But it's interesting because it strikes me, well, not only that it's the ultimate dystopia, because that's straightforward, something that starts utopia could end up being that, but utopia is quite a rich word, and I think the way I understand when it was conceived, it had to do with the ultimate efficiency, the ultimate practicality. Does that sit comfortably with the notion of utopia? And perhaps the utopias that you touched on in your the sort of 18th century and 19th century visions, isn't it a much sort of narrower version?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of used utopia as a way of weighing up the idea of the intention and what happens when intention is realised. Is it always realised in the way that it wants to be? But also as a way of sort of looking to the future and how it might be reconsidered. More as a way in which, I mean, I discussed it in the thesis about how you might be using sort of a utopia of reconstruction, how it might actually be a practical utopia, that by allowing people the idea that they have the ability to change the city, kind of opening up the right to the city, you might be able to then enable a sort of the idea that it's possible to achieve something by way of utopia, but as a kind of a practical end goal rather than as this kind of unrealizable dream. That there's kind of scales of the utopian idea that aren't just this huge swathed scope, that then when you realise there's a really impractical vision that actually using utopia as a practical way to reopen the right to the city, it might be a way of reconsidering these cities.
Can I ask another question? We talked about the linear development, but you didn't mention the idea of the linear city, which was very much about in Europe at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
Did you go into that?
So, I mean, the model that obviously Newton proposed wasn't the first, and he looked at the field radio, he looked at Corbusier and looked at the idea that this could be a way of using a city that had been proposed with a different intention behind it, and how you might then use that model in a different way. So I mean, this kind of European idea of the linear city was very dominant when they were proposing these models. And actually they used this kind of very Western idea of production and capitalism and perfect linear city, but then took that model and used it in a slightly different way. Which is
I was thinking specifically of Soria Mata and the idea of the linear city.
Yeah,
did that come up?
Yeah, briefly.
So I'm at a disadvantage, I haven't read it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so this is the idea that the city could carry on growing and propose a model by which the city could kind of continue to expand in the way that it was initially intended.
David?
Firstly, gripping subject. You're not going to get me dismissing the socialist city as dystopian, by the way. For me, the heroism and the clarity of the vision is absolutely second to none. And if Western neoliberalism can produce such potent iconography which will last so well and persuade 400,000 people that are not going to leave that city, I'll be very, very surprised. If the oligarchs can produce something that actually has the potency, as I say, of that vision. I think the Western critique of the socialist city is inevitably flawed. I just don't think we ever get the cultural and political circumstance that led to its creation. So I think that it's easy when one's making a critique of the mono-city that one overemphasises the aspects of control and so on, and actually forgets the synergy between building and landscape, and actually, more to the point, you know, the huge difference, if you look at Soviet industry and Detroit-based industry, if you go to a Soviet factory, it will have a theatre, it will have a creche, it will have a subsidised canteen, it will actually have a complete programme for the life of the individual and the life of the family, which is entirely absent in the Western model. So there are huge aspects, I think, of the constructional and functional and social agenda that don't always get touched on. Yes, of course, there are issues of maintenance and so on. I mean, for me, it's just this question, you know, will the next 50 or 100 years see something that has that clarity, that bravery attached to it?
What's your view? Do you have a
What's my view? I think it's ambition, and I think someone was saying last night that actually, you know, architects have these really sort of optimistic views of what they can produce and the sort of impact that they can have. And I think these cities were actually built with great optimism and hope, and that they would be something very successful. And in the realisation, maybe they have been, maybe it's a different judgment that we need to consider.
Does anyone have any questions? Yes, just.
Hi. I'm not going to touch on utopia, which some people understand the meaning of that. But anyway, I thought your topic is fascinating, and your overview was quite comprehensive, it seemed to me. But it was largely descriptive. And I imagine that's a result of having to distill it for the kind of presentation you just made. But that's left me very, very curious about the conclusions that you've drawn from it and what you want to do with it, and then that. And I'm wondering if you worked at all with Zangettin's We. Do you know the book?
I don't know.
Because I think Zangettin's We would be a kind of a description of the controlled city from someone from within it who was not happy. He lived in Newcastle for a while building icebreakers, but then went back to Russia. And for many years, we wasn't published and had to be swamped out. But anyway, I encourage you to look at We, which is a precursor to 1984 and Brave New World. But I am very interested to know what the conclusions, what conclusions you draw from the work you've done and what you want to do with it.
I mean, principally, I think, given this project took sort of under a year, I was initially, as you say, is very descriptive because it's not so much a phenomenon, but something that our media isn't that interested in at the moment, and it's not something that's received a huge amount of publication or that has been widely looked at. So just as a sort of face value, it has been a really interesting thing to look at these cities and why they were made and what the intentions were behind them and what kind of a state they are in now. But actually further to that, I think it makes us look at sort of what the way in which kind of we use space or has the potential to be this really socially manipulative tool, whether that's conscious or not. And I think that's something that I really have drawn from that there's this, makes it sound a little bit grand, but this sort of responsibility, I guess, to acknowledge that's a position that architects are in, and that optimistic or not, that there's kind of this thing that might happen as a result of what's being built. And then how, actually over a relatively short span of time, so it's kind of 50 years to a decade, how things can change as a result of political situations, and how building a city with political implications then has a time frame, because it's essentially built on something that will move, because the political ideology behind it will change. So I guess if you build something that is so instilled in politics, how is that then going to change when the idea behind it changes and when the people sort of take control of the city?
Thank you. Thank you, Tamsin. I think we must move on now. Thank you very much. Thank you.